So there's a video that's been making the rounds online, and wow, it paints a really grim picture of the situation in Kyiv. The speakers are alleging that the city is right on the verge of collapse. Today, we're going to break down the very serious claims they made about a severe winter crisis that's got a hold on Ukraine's capital. Let's dig into what they're actually saying. I mean, just listen to this quote from one of the speakers in the video. "The houses are turning into concrete coffins." That's an incredibly powerful statement that really sets the stakes for what they describe as a life or death situation for the people living there. And this is why that quote hits so hard. This is the reality they're facing. We're talking about temperatures plunging to minus 20 degrees Celsius, that's minus 4 Fahrenheit. When it's that cold, not having basic utilities goes from being a major problem to an absolute catastrophe. All right, so to really unpack what they're arguing, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the crisis itself. Then, we'll dive into a really shocking military allegation. After that, we'll get into the accusations of corruption, understand the human cost of all this, and finally touch on the political backdrop they're describing. So first up, the crisis. The core of the speaker's claim is that Kyiv is going through what they call a communal collapse. And let's be clear, they aren't just talking about some minor inconveniences here. They're talking about the fundamental systems that keep a huge modern city running, failing, right in the middle of winter. So what does that actually look like for people on the ground? Well, according to the source, you've got no water supply for anyone living above the 10th floor. Widespread heat and electricity outages. It's gotten so bad, they say, that Kyiv's mayor has even urged some residents to evacuate. And all of this is happening while forecasts are predicting it could get even colder, maybe dropping to minus 25 Celsius. And this isn't just a few isolated buildings. The speaker alleges that just the day before their broadcast, a staggering 6,000 homes were completely without heat. They also claim that in some areas, authorities are actually draining the water out of the heating systems, which is a really bad sign that they don't expect service to be back anytime soon. Okay, so here's where things take a really sharp turn. The speakers don't just blame the crisis on enemy attacks. They point the finger at a very specific and, frankly, shocking military decision, which they see as a deliberate and disastrous command. It all comes down to this one big question they're asking. Kyiv is supposed to have some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world, right? So how are these Iranian-made Shahed drones still getting through and hitting critical infrastructure like heating and power plants? And here's their answer. It's an absolutely explosive claim. They allege that a direct order was issued telling units not to use anti-drone rockets against these Shahads once they're over the city itself. They even claim this order is public information and that it's the direct reason for the recent successful strikes on Kyiv's infrastructure. You can just feel the speaker's total bewilderment and suspicion in this quote. They're questioning the motive, right? Wondering if it's betrayal or just monumental incompetence. But in the end, they just say, "I cannot explain it." They're at a total loss. And that question, treachery or idiocy, leads right into their next major point, corruption. They argue that the city is so vulnerable not just because of bad orders, but because of missing money and maybe even infiltration by hostile agents. Yeah, they put a huge number on the table, 20 billion hryvnia. They're basically asking, where did it go? This was money supposedly set aside to build protective structures around these exact kinds of critical sites, and they're demanding a public accounting for it. But you know, it's not just about the money. To really drive home their point about a much deeper, more systemic problem, they tell this one particular story. And honestly, it's a jaw-dropper. They use it as an example of what they see as a massive failure in state security. Get this, they talk about two brothers. Brother number one is a colonel in the Russian army, commanding forces shelling southern Ukraine. Now his own brother, they claim, holds an official job in a Ukrainian military recruitment center, where his job is to mobilize Ukrainians to go fight his brother's army. The speakers use this story to pose a really pointed question. How on earth does someone with that kind of direct conflict of interest get access to state secrets? So all of these alleged failures, the bad orders, the potential corruption, it all has a real devastating impact on people. And that's where the speakers turn their focus next, the human toll on the civilians in Kyiv. And the picture they paint is just grim. The elderly and children are obviously the most vulnerable in these freezing temperatures. The city's official warming centers, the points of invincibility, are described as completely inadequate, totally overwhelmed.
They even tell a story about one family with 3 little kids who are seriously considering fleeing the country as refugees simply because they're afraid their children won't survive the winter. And on top of all that, there's this growing fear that if people start evacuating in large numbers, their empty homes will be looted.
All right, for the final piece of their argument, they draw this really stark contrast between all that civilian suffering and what they describe as political maneuvering and a deeply flawed mobilization effort. They're suggesting a huge disconnect between the leadership and the people. The speakers just sound absolutely furious about this. They're saying, while people are literally freezing in their homes, some political figures are allegedly busy setting up new political projects. They specifically mention a plan to create a Party of the Southeast, calling it nothing but political gamesmanship at the worst possible time. And they don't hold back on the mobilization debate either. They see these high-level meetings about corruption in recruitment centers as just PR. They point to proposed laws that would cancel student deferments and lower the mobilization age. And their solution? It's pretty radical. They say, send all the current staff from the recruitment centers to the front lines and replace them with wounded veterans who, they argue, actually understand the reality of war. And to justify why such a drastic change is needed, the speaker throws out this massive number. They claim there are currently 400,000 soldiers who have abandoned their posts without leave. They're presenting this as a key indicator that there's a serious demotivation problem within the army. So that brings us back to the huge question hanging over all of this, the central question posed by the source material. When you put all these claims together, this communal collapse in Kyiv, the alleged order not to shoot down drones, the missing billions, the story of the two brothers, what are we looking at here? Are these events, as described by the speakers, the result of incompetence, deep-seated corruption, or something that looks a lot more like betrayal?